Howdy, everybody. So, have you ever heard terms like gig economy or that's a nice gig? Or, you know, uh, what are people talking about when you're saying, you know, that there's opportunities for these types of jobs are considered gig employment? Well, this is the idea of a 1099 independent contractor. Now, 1099 is a IRS tax code. Instead of having a W 2 for an employee, you get a 1099 as an independent contractor. So, companies will often use independent contractors similar to using temporary workers. Um, both are not employees. A temporary worker is not really an employee. They're brought on usually for 30, 60, 90 days. Now, they may become an employee if they're an exceptional worker, and the company may do like a temp to hire type scenario. Well, contract workers are similar, but not exactly the same. They're brought in on a independent contractor business need. They're not employees, so they're not going to be counted on the employee payroll or head count. They're there to perform a task. It could be short term, it could be long term. But this is the idea of a gig employee, is that it's a flexible labor that company uses. Um, they may bring in specialists. They may bring in someone, for a project for something, and they're going to pay them as an independent contractor. So typically, when you're compensated, you get what's like gross income, and then the independent contractor will pay for their own Social Security, Medicare, and health benefits and taxes. The employer or the company just gives them a gross amount, and then the independent contractor is paid for the job, and then it's up to the independent contractor to pay all their own taxes, Medicare, Social Security, health insurance, state, local taxes, federal taxes, all that stuff. So it really is a kind of like a symbiotic relationship where you have a host and then you have the independent contractor. You know, uh, it's something that's becoming more and more common. It wasn't very common, for example, in the 70s or 80s, maybe not even in the 90s. But as the internet became more useful in the years 2000 and later, job opportunities were being posted. Companies were looking for independent contractors, 1099 type gig employees or gig workers. They there's a huge cost for companies to hire and put someone on their payroll. Because now they're going to have to pay half of their the responsibility for Social Security and Medicare, which is 7.5%. So if they just agree to a flat cost for an independent contractor, then the independent contractor takes on the whole amount, 15% for Social Security and Medicare. And there's costs for the company to have you covered under their benefit plan or pension plans or retirement plans. So there's a lot of advantages for companies to hire gig workers. And the workers themselves prefer the flexibility of being independent contractors. They're independent contractors cover many types of industries, not just trucking. But there's literally thousands of different types of jobs that people are using as gig jobs, as independent contractors. And this works for them. And their families, their household, their needs. It's really attractive for seniors, for example, who don't want to be full-time employees but still want to be active in the workforce and maybe supplement their retirement they can go take jobs as independent contractors. A lot of times retirees have a wealth of expertise that they're willing to share with corporations on an independent contractor basis. They're not looking for full time employment. They don't want to be considered an employee either. So for them, it's a way for them to make extra money. And you take, for example, stay at home moms or dads, whichever. They can often find work as independent contractors, that meets their needs for childcare and things like this. They can work around their schedule. Oftentimes they can work from home. So there's enormous advantages of being an independent contractor. And I think Gen X, Y, and Z are more likely to embrace the use of technology because they kind of are geared that way. They're raised through, they've come of age during a time of technology breakthroughs like the internet. Um, they're more likely to, see the advantages of independent contractor for their employment needs versus traditional workforce, maybe the baby boomer generation or something, who thinks that you have to have a job that's 40 hours a week, Monday through Friday, and has a pension plan and things like that. Younger workers don't necessarily agree with that philosophy. They're like, no, we want more control over our work. We want to be the boss. We want to take advantage of this independent contractor business opportunity. We want to be small business owners. We want the flexibility of choosing when we work and how we work and things like this. So uh, the younger generations embrace this type of way of doing work. It's not the 9 to 5 model. They've kind of broken that model. The independent contractor is is very appealing. So as truck drivers, as owner operators, we're released on with big box carriers. We're independent contractors as well. Um, we may have long term relationships with the companies that we lease with, but essentially we are gig employees, or we're gig. These are gig jobs. I wouldn't say you're employees, but you're you are participating in the gig economy. So and a gig is just like you know a way to make money that's not necessarily long term. A lot of times you'll hear people say, "Well, that's a nice gig." It's not necessarily a long term thing. It can be, but typically gigs are shorter in nature. So there's a lot of controversy about 1099 independent contractors. California AB5. I mean, they're trying to support unions who want traditional employees. Unions don't like independent contractors. Tell you that right now. They don't like it. If it was up to the unions, there would be no independent contractors because they can't organize and do collective bargaining as long as there's independent contractors all around. But the numbers are growing for independent contractors, whereas you see union jobs are on the decline, but independent contractor jobs are on the rise. So it's a battle for sure between the two. But as an owner or operator, at least on a big box carrier, you need to realize that you're an independent contractor. You're part of the gig economy. You're a small business owner, and you may be leased on with a big box carrier, but that doesn't mean you're going to be there for your entire career. You might be, many are, but not necessarily. By definition, you're not an employee, and you're responsible for all your own retirement. You're not participating in the company profit sharing plan. You're not in company 401k. You may you may have some, benefits of savings by getting your health insurance through the corporation, but you're still paying for it yourself 100%. You're paying for your full Social Security and Medicare. You're paying for your own workers' comp, for example. So this is the responsibility of the independent contractor, is to pay their own way. It's like, you're going to get an overhead gross, you know, payment from the corporation. But after that, you pay for everything, so, which independent contractors like. This is what they love to do. They have control, they have the flexibility, they have the freedom, that they're not locked in with this corporation that is going to treat them like an employee. And there's certain things that independent contractors have to have. They have to have control over their work assignments. They have to have the freedom to choose. So like for truck drivers, you have to have the ability to choose your loads, for example. You have to have the ability to agree or not agree to take a load. There's no forced dispatch, for example. So these types of freedoms are characteristics of it being an independent contractor. You're not under the company's control. You have the right as an independent contractor to refuse to do that job. It's like, no, I don't want to do that one. Find me another one. So this is the whole idea of the gig economy. Gig workers pick and choose their jobs that they want to do. They work when they want to work. They have the flexibility. They pay their own way. They're paid to do a job, and then the independent contractor pays all their own stuff. So it gives the corporations a lot of flexibility to hire independent contractors. And let's say there is a slowdown in the workforce or a slowdown in the economy. You got employees on the payroll are going to be more protected from layoffs than independent contractors. Typically, independent contractors are considered part of the flex workforce. That when there's a lot of work to do, there's more independent contractors. When there's less work to do, there's less independent contractors. So if you are a 20-year employee, the corporation during a slowdown and layoff period is not going to lay off their 20-year employees who've been loyal to them for their entire careers. Instead, they're going to look at those temporary workers or those independent contractors and say, okay, your services are no longer needed, because they don't have enough work to go around. So if you're an independent contractor, owner, operator, you might want to give a lot of thought about who you're leasing to, because if you're leasing your truck to a small operation, say 100 drivers, and their loads are drying up, because the economy and the freight market, the opportunities are becoming fewer and fewer. Well, they got employees who are drivers, and then they may have, a small percentage who are owner operators. They're not going to lay off their employees and save the owner operators. No, that's not how it works. They're going to cut back on the independent contractors. So, I always found value in leasing with big trucking companies like Crete, Schneider, uh, Mercer, Landstar. A big company like Swift, for example. I've talked to some owner operators at Swift. They're doing okay. Um, but the big corporations generally don't, they're not fazed by changes in the trucking market. They'll make adjustments, but they're not looking to lay off 100 drivers. So it's an independent contractor, as a gig employee. If you want that long-term relationship with the corporation, bigger is better. Better better cost savings. Oftentimes they pass on the discounts, for parts and labor, and benefits. So if you're paying for everything yourself, you're going to be more tuned into what things cost. It's like, you shop around for health insurance and you realize how expensive that is. And you get big discounts from a big box carrier. And the threat of being downsized or having your job eliminated, it's less likely with the big box carrier. It's almost not going to happen. It's not guaranteed, but the odds are that's not going to happen. Now, if you're with a smaller company, it's highly likely that as an owner operator, they'll cut you loose first before they start cutting or downsizing their company drivers, their employees. So you got to keep that in mind. But the gig workforce or the gig economy, it's just growing. More and more people are attracted to uh, the 1099 independent contractor. That they prefer that the type of working relationship rather than being an employee. And if you look at the history of corporations, especially non-union, they outsource jobs to third world countries or overseas, or they close their facility and move to China or Mexico. People don't have faith in employment, long-term employment with these corporations. The idea you're going to work somewhere for 40 years and retire with a gold watch and a pension, nobody really believes that, anymore. That was something from the 1950s and 60s that, over the decades has just gone away. Corporations feel no loyalty to their employees. There's no guarantee that you're going to retire from that company you're going to work with. And as a result, the employees don't feel loyal to the corporation either. And it's like, why put your destiny or your fate in the hands of a corporation that will pull the rug out from underneath you at any moment without any notice? It's like, you got your house and dependents and the car payment and all this stuff all riding on that job that could be taken away from you at a moment's notice. That's very uneasy feeling. There's like no security, no job security at all. Well, as a gig employee, you acknowledge this fact. You're like, well, this is a gig economy, and I don't expect any loyalty from any corporation, and I will take responsibility as being self-employed, and I will find my own work, and I will work as a 1099 independent contractor. I'll pay for my own benefits. I'll pay for my own retirement, and I won't ever count on a corporation, to provide a long-lasting career and job security, because that is seemingly asking too much. It's like, don't count on anybody. Be more independent. Be more secure in yourself, knowing that you're capable of finding your own work and providing for your own needs. You don't need, these corporations for anything. If you're an independent contractor, it's on you. And if you have the skills and the experience and the confidence to go out there and say, look, I don't need ABC company to provide anything for me. I will take care of it myself. I will be in charge of my own, benefits and retirement and health insurance. I don't need a corporation to provide those things for me. All I need is to find those type of opportunities. As a gig worker, you know, the opportunities are very good, especially in trucking. Especially in trucking, you know, it's great. If you're the right type of individual. Some people don't like the freedom. With freedom, you have to do more work. So Some people don't want that much freedom, as strange as that may sound. They like the comfort and convenience of being an employee. But if you're looking for higher paying opportunities, and you have some business skills, then a gig opportunity is right up your alley. It's like, this is perfect. What else could you possibly want? In many cases, independent contractors like achieving the American dream. It's like you are a small business owner. It doesn't get any better than that. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.